I, as my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
It is a little after midnight on July 22nd, 1991, and a Milwaukee squad car is cruising down a quiet stretch of North 25th Street when the headlights catch something strange. A grown man jogging down the middle of the road, shirtless, with a single handcuff hanging loose from one wrist. The officers pull over. The man is shaking so badly, he can barely get the words out. His name is Tracy Edwards. Someone just tried to kill him. He tells them there's an apartment a few blocks back. A man invited him there a few hours earlier, offered him money to drink beer, watch a movie, and pose for some photographs. Somewhere in that apartment the mood turned, and Edwards found himself handcuffed, staring down a knife, listening to a stranger press an ear to his chest to listen to his heartbeat, and quietly promise to eat it. Edwards had spent close to 4 hours talking his way through that apartment, agreeing to whatever kept the man calm, waiting for the one moment his attacker's guard dropped before he finally broke free, hit the man hard enough to knock him down, and ran. The officers are skeptical. It sounds like a domestic dispute that got out of hand, but they walk Edwards back to the building anyway, to apartment 213. The man who answers the door is calm, almost pleasant. His name is Jeffrey Dahmer. He explains it was a misunderstanding, offers to fetch the key for the cuffs, invites the officers inside while he looks for it. It's an ordinary-looking apartment. Then one of the officers notices a kitchen drawer full of knives. Then a stack of Polaroids on top of a dresser. Dozens of them. Men in various states of undress. Then men who are clearly dead, some of them cut apart. The mood in the room changes instantly. Dahmer is wrestled to the floor and cuffed. When police open the refrigerator a few minutes later, they find a human head resting on the bottom shelf. There are more heads in the freezer. 2 skulls sit on top of a filing cabinet. In the corner of the bedroom is a blue 55-gallon drum containing several decomposing bodies dissolving in a chemical bath. Before the night is over, investigators will begin to understand that they have just stumbled onto one of the worst killing sprees in American history, and that it could have been stopped years, maybe a decade earlier. To understand how a man got away with this for so long, you have to go back to a much quieter, much sadder beginning. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the first child of Lionel Dahmer, a chemist, and Joyce Dahmer, who struggled with her mental health throughout a marriage that grew more strained by the year. The family soon moved to Bath, Ohio, a small, tidy town where, by most accounts, Jeffrey wasn't an obviously troubled child. Teachers and neighbors remember a quiet, painfully shy boy, not cruel, not violent, just increasingly hard to reach. Something in him seemed to withdraw a little further every year, until by high school he had become something like a fixture in the background of every room he was in, present, polite, and almost invisible. Somewhere in early adolescence, the withdrawal turned into something stranger. He began collecting roadkill from the ditches near his house, raccoons, squirrels, whatever he could find, bringing the carcasses home to dissect them, and, in some cases, to preserve the bones in jars in a shed behind the house. Taken on its own, that habit unsettled a few of the adults around him, but plenty of odd, lonely teenage hobbies unsettle adults without turning into anything more. What almost no one around him seemed to notice was that his sexual fantasies, taking shape around that same time, had already begun fusing themselves to violence and to the total, controllable stillness of an unconscious or lifeless body. The beginning of a fantasy he would later describe simply as wanting someone who could never leave. By his last 2 years of high school, he was drinking every day, hiding liquor in his locker and in soda cans, and the drinking only deepened the isolation that was already swallowing him. 3 weeks after he graduated in June of 1978, that fantasy found its first real outlet. Driving around one evening, Dahmer picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, who was on his way to a rock concert, and invited him back to the Dahmer family home. His parents were separated and out of the house that day, to drink beer and listen to music. The two spent hours together. When Hicks finally said he needed to go, Dahmer was overtaken by a wave of panic at the idea of being left alone again, and he picked up a barbell and struck him with it, then strangled him to make sure he was dead. He later admitted that part of what drove him that night was a fantasy he had held since he was 16 years old, a partner who would never get up and walk away. He dismembered Hicks's body in the crawl space of the house, buried the remains in a shallow grave on the property. Then, sometime later, dug them back up, dissolved the flesh in acid, crushed what bone remained with a sledgehammer, and scattered it across the wooded ravine behind the house. He was 18 years old, and no one, not his parents, not the police, not a single person in Bath, Ohio, ever knew that a young man had been murdered a few hundred yards from their homes. And then, almost unbelievably, nothing happened for 9 years. Dahmer enlisted in the army not long after, and was stationed for a time in Germany, where his drinking became severe enough that he was discharged early. He drifted for a while afterward, eventually settling with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, working ordinary jobs. Mixing chocolate on the overnight shift at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory was one of them. And drinking, by every account, constantly. He would later tell investigators that the urge to kill had never actually gone away during those 9 quiet years. What had been missing wasn't the desire. It was the opportunity and the nerve. Small warning signs surfaced along the way, and each one was handled with the kind of leniency that, in hindsight, reads as almost unbearable. In 1986, he was arrested for exposing himself in front of 2 young boys and received a year of probation. The pattern that would define the rest of his life. Men and boys approached with an offer, drugged, and then something worse, had already begun to take shape by 1987, when he met a 24-year-old man named Stephen Twomey at a gay bar in Milwaukee. The two checked into a hotel room together and drank heavily. Dahmer would later claim he woke the next morning to find Twomey dead beside him, with no memory of how it happened. Whatever the truth of that blackout, it marked the moment the killing resumed. He bought a large suitcase, used it to move Twomey's body to his grandmother's basement, and disposed of the remains there. The killing did not stop again. A 14-year-old named Jamie Dockstader crossed his path not long after. Dahmer lured him to that same basement with an offer of $50 to pose for photographs, then drugged, strangled, and dismembered him, destroying what remained with a sledgehammer. Around the same period, he met 25-year-old Richard Guerrero outside a Milwaukee bar with a similar offer of cash, and Guerrero was killed there too. His grandmother, increasingly unsettled by the late nights, the strange smells, and the strangers he brought home, eventually asked him to move out, and in 1988 Dahmer had already been accumulating the kind of history that should have stopped him cold. That same September, he lured a 13-year-old boy into an apartment with the promise of $50 for photographs, drugged his coffee, and sexually assaulted him. He pleaded guilty, claiming he believed the boy was older, and was released to await sentencing. It was during that waiting period, out on bail, formally facing a criminal court for the assault of a child, with a sentencing date already on the calendar, that Dahmer committed one of the murders that would later come to define public fury at how the system had failed to stop him. On the night of March 25, 1989, 26-year-old Anthony Sears, an aspiring model who worked as a restaurant manager, was out at a Milwaukee gay club called La Cage with friends. He met Dahmer there. Before the group split up for the night, one of Sears's friends reminded him he was expected home for Easter, and to call if he needed a ride. Sears never called. He was planning to celebrate a recent promotion with his mother the next day. Dahmer brought him back to his grandmother's house, where they had sex. Dahmer drugged his drink, and once Sears was unconscious, strangled him. He would later say he didn't want to lose Sears the way he'd lost the others. Sears became the first victim from whom Dahmer preserved a keepsake, mummifying his head and genitals and keeping them, for a time, in his work locker. 2 months later, in May of 1989, Dahmer stood before a judge for the assault of the 13-year-old boy, with no idea that the judge or anyone else in the room was aware he had murdered someone in the interim. He was, by every account, the model of contrition, soft-spoken, apologetic, insisting that the arrest had been a wake-up call and that he desperately wanted to change his life. It worked. His defense attorney argued he needed treatment rather than prison, and the judge agreed, sentencing him to 1 year with work release, allowing him to keep his job at the chocolate factory during the day and report to a corrections facility only at night, along with 5 years of probation and a requirement to register as a sex offender. He served less than the full year before being released early for good behavior. Within months of walking free, he'd rented an apartment of his own on North 25th Street, the apartment that would eventually become synonymous with his name. It was in that apartment that his method hardened into something close to routine. He would find men, usually at gay bars, bus stops, or shopping malls, offer them cash to come back and pose nude for photographs, then drug their drinks and strangle them once they lost consciousness. 28-year-old Edward Eddie Smith disappeared in the summer of 1990 after meeting Dahmer this way. So did 33-year-old Ricky Beeks. 22-year-old Ernest Miller and 23-year-old David Thomas were killed within weeks of each other later that year. 18-year-old Curtis Strotter, picked up at a bus stop after Dahmer offered him money to pose for photographs, became his 9th victim in February 1991. Around this time, Dahmer began experimenting with something even more disturbing than murder itself, an attempt to keep a victim alive but permanently compliant. He would later admit to drilling small holes into the skulls of at least a few of his victims and pouring in acid or boiling water, hoping to induce a kind of lasting, docile stupor, a real-world echo of the same fantasy that had haunted him since Stephen Hicks, someone who would never leave, because they would never again be fully present enough to want to. It never worked as he intended. 19-year-old Errol Lindsay, killed in April of 1991, was one of the victims subjected to this experiment. He regained consciousness in pain and confusion before Dahmer drugged and strangled him. 24-year-old Anthony Tony Hughes, who was deaf and communicated primarily through writing and sign language, was murdered in that same apartment weeks later. Dahmer would later tell investigators that consuming parts of some of his victims felt, to him, like a way of making them permanently part of him, a grotesque, final attempt to solve the one problem that had never gone away: how to keep someone from ever walking out the door. It's against this backdrop, a man deep into an active killing spree, living in a building where neighbors had already complained more than once about strange odors and strange sounds, that the case takes its most damning turn. On the night of May 27, 1991, a 14-year-old Laotian immigrant named Konarak Synthesumphone stumbled out of Dahmer's apartment building naked, bleeding, and heavily drugged. 2 women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, spotted him on the sidewalk in obvious distress and refused to leave his side, calling the police and insisting something was seriously wrong. When officers John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, along with a third, less experienced officer providing backup, they found a boy who could barely stand or speak. Dahmer appeared moments later, calm and cooperative, and told the officers that Konarak was actually his 19-year-old boyfriend, that the two of them had simply had too much to drink during an argument. Incredibly, the officers walked Dahmer and the disoriented boy back into the apartment to check the story, apparently never registering that another one of Dahmer's victims was already dead inside those same walls. Once inside, they found nude photographs of Konarak that struck them as consistent with a consensual relationship, and despite the boy's evident distress, despite his inability to stand on his own, despite 2 witnesses standing outside insisting he was in danger, the officers helped walk him back into Dahmer's apartment and left. A recording from that night captured one of the officers joking about needing to be deloused after the call. Neither officer ran a background check that would have surfaced Dahmer's standing conviction for the sexual assault of a child, information that in all likelihood would have unraveled the story in minutes. The women who had called it and phoned the police station again and again afterward, trying to make someone understand that the boy looked like a child, that something was deeply wrong. It didn't change the outcome. Roughly 30 minutes after the officers drove away, Dahmer killed Konarak Synthesumphone. Both officers were fired once the case became public and the recording surfaced. Both were reinstated years later on appeal, with back pay, a decision that remains bitterly contested to this day, not least by the very neighbors who had tried to save the boy's life. The killing did not stop there, and in some ways it only accelerated. 20-year-old Matt Turner and 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger were both killed in the weeks that followed. Weinberger after Dahmer met him at a bookstore in Chicago and persuaded him to travel back to Milwaukee with him. 23-year-old Oliver Lacey and 25-year-old Joseph Braidhoft, his final 2 victims, were killed within days of each other in mid-July of 1991, Braidhoft only 3 days before a man named Tracy Edwards walked into that same apartment for a movie, a few beers and some photographs, and unlike everyone who came before him, walked back out. What finally ended it, in other words, wasn't a breakthrough in police work or a change in Dahmer's behavior. It was one intended victim's composure under unimaginable pressure, and a small stroke of luck that 2 responding officers happened to look twice at a stack of photographs before leaving the room. Had Edwards not found that one moment to break free, had the officers not noticed the dresser, there's little reason to believe the killing would have stopped when it did. Once Dahmer was in custody, he began confessing almost immediately, walking detectives through murder after murder with a methodical calm that unsettled even hardened investigators, describing each victim, each method, each disposal in careful detail, and telling them at one point that no one had had the slightest idea what was happening for over a decade. Forensic teams spent days combing through the apartment, eventually linking 11 separate sets of remains to the scene itself and recovering close to 80 Polaroid photographs documenting the murders, along with acid drums, preserved skulls, and organs kept in the freezer. News of the discovery spread through Milwaukee within hours, and crowds began gathering outside the apartment building before the day was over. Some out of horrified curiosity, some in open grief, since many of the missing men and boys had vanished from that very neighborhood, and their families had spent months or years not knowing what had happened to them. Dahmer was ultimately charged with 15 murders in Wisconsin. Evidence didn't support pursuing a 16th Wisconsin case, though he was separately linked to the killing of Stephen Hicks back in Ohio. His trial opened in Milwaukee in January of 1992 under intense media scrutiny, and it exposed racial and social tensions that ran through the entire case. The vast majority of his victims were Black, Asian, or Latino, many of them gay or bisexual men living on the margins of a city that, as his own defense had once benefited from, was often quick to look past them. The jury selected to hear the case included only one Black member, a detail that drew sharp criticism from victims' families and civil rights advocates alike, who argued that the racial makeup of both the victims and the courtroom said something uncomfortable about whose disappearances got taken seriously in the first place. Dahmer's attorneys mounted an insanity defense, and it wasn't built on nothing. Psychiatric evaluations after his arrest diagnosed him with genuine, serious conditions, including borderline personality disorder, a psychotic disorder, and traits consistent with schizotypal personality disorder. But prosecutors argued, and the jury ultimately agreed, that however disturbed his mind was, he understood exactly what he was doing at every step and knew it was wrong. The careful cover-ups, the years spent avoiding detection, the calculated stories told to police and neighbors alike, all pointed away from a total break from reality and toward a man in full, deliberate control of his actions. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty and legally sane on every count. The sentencing hearing that followed gave victims' families a chance to speak that many of them had waited years for. One woman, Rita Isbell, whose brother Errol Lindsay had been killed after Dahmer drilled into his skull, rose from her seat and screamed directly at Dahmer, a burst of raw, unfiltered grief that cut through the courtroom's clinical procedure and became, in the years since, one of the single most replayed and referenced moments of the entire case. Other families spoke more quietly, describing sons and brothers who had simply never come home, whose absences had gone unanswered by police for months at a time before Dahmer's arrest finally explained what had happened to them. Dahmer himself read a short, halting statement, saying he knew nothing could undo what he had done and that he hoped his own death might eventually bring the families some measure of peace. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in total once the Ohio conviction for Stephen Hicks was added, with no possibility of parole. In prison, Dahmer was initially kept apart from the general population for his own protection, a reasonable precaution given how reviled he was even among other convicted killers. Over time, he requested more contact with other inmates and was gradually allowed to work alongside them on prison labor details. That decision nearly cost him his life in July of 1994 when a fellow inmate attacked him. He survived. It didn't save him the second time. On November 28, 1994, while assigned to clean a prison gymnasium alongside 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson, a convicted murderer, and Christopher Scarver, a young man serving time for murder who had a documented history of severe mental illness. Scarver beat both Dahmer and Anderson to death with a metal bar taken from prison exercise equipment. Dahmer was 34 years old. Scarver would later describe the killing less as a random act of prison violence than as something closer to an execution he felt entitled to carry out himself, given what Dahmer had done and the fact that the justice system had, in his eyes, still allowed him to go on living. Dahmer had murdered his first victim 16 years earlier as an 18-year-old with no criminal record and no obvious warning signs beyond a fascination with dead animals and a bottle hidden in his locker. It took a wrongly lenient sentence in 1989, a fatally mishandled call about a bleeding 14-year-old boy in 1991, and finally the composure of one man who refused to become victim number 18 to bring 13 years of killing to an end. And even then, the end came only because two officers happened to glance twice at a stack of photographs before walking out the door. What lingers about this case, more than 3 decades on, isn't really the question of what made Dahmer capable of what he did. Psychiatrists who spent months evaluating him after his arrest never landed on a single, satisfying answer for that, and it's unlikely anyone ever will. Some blend of a fractured home life, an escalating and increasingly violent private fantasy life, heavy and near-constant drinking, and a set of diagnosed psychiatric conditions that explain a great deal about how he thought without ever fully explaining why he acted. What lingers instead is everything that surrounded him while the killing was happening. A 13-year-old assaulted in a court that called it a turning point. A 14-year-old walked back into the hands of the man who would kill him half an hour later. Neighbors who smelled and heard things for months and were waved off. A lenient judge, an indifferent background check, a joke about being deloused. And underneath all of it, 17 men and boys, most of them young, many of them gay or bisexual, many of them black, Asian, or Latino, many of them living in circumstances that made the world around them slower to notice they were gone, whose names, more than 30 years later, are still far less widely known than the name of the man who took their lives.